The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Welcome back to all our listeners to another episode of Voices in Validation. We're so glad you are here with us today. We are welcoming back today a past guest for us, Siegfried Schmitt. He is here once again in studio to chat with us, this time about change management and change control. So welcome, Siegfried. It's great to have you with us again.
Thank you, Stacey, and welcome everyone.
Excellent. So I'm starting to hear a little bit more about change management and change control. Again, I know it's a historic topic in validation, but I'm hearing more of it recently. I'm not sure why. Maybe you can help us figure that out. But just for our listeners to catch them up, get them up to speed, change control is part of a good manufacturing practices concept, and it focuses on managing change to prevent unintended consequences. So as part of a company's standard operating procedure, guidelines ensuring changes are hopefully implemented in a controlled and coordinated manner. But can you talk to us a little bit about the intricacies of change management or change control and why, maybe, if you know, we're starting to hear about that more again?
Well, yes, Stacey. So what is being discussed lately is that change management or good change management is an indicator whether the quality management system of a company is well set up and well under control. It's like a quality metric, so to speak, for the quality system as a whole. And this is just in its early days, but it's a thinking amongst the regulators, and that isn't just, let's say, US FDA. That is on the global scale through PICS. So therefore, really paying attention to your change management process is worthwhile. And so your question about the SOP and that it has to cover what is change management in your place. So what needs to be in it? It has to cover the entire process. And what I mean by that is it's from the change proposal. Someone needs to come up and say, we need or we want a particular change. It has to be assessed. There has to be some planning and implementation. And once this has all occurred, there has to be a change review to see, was the change done correctly? Did they follow what they should follow as your process? And has the change been effective? Does it work? Has it achieved what you wanted? And that is for all categories of change. So let's be clear. Yes, change management is a critical process, and thus the SOP should be well written. And we also have to remember not every change is the same as another. So, for example, changing a valve is definitely different from replacing a whole dryer. So the processes that you have in your SOP for managing the changes must be risk-based.
Which makes total sense, right? You got to prioritize things. It seems like that's a common thread throughout the validation industry, validation focused folks in the pharmaceutical industry. So I imagine that as with most best practices, your standard operating procedures are your guideline, but there arises a need to prioritize things, as you mentioned, based on the level of risk. And that may or may not be represented in your SOP, correct?
Mm,
Right.
yes.
Because I've heard a couple of times you speak about this particular topic, and there's varying levels of formality here that you've alluded to in the past. So can you talk a little bit about that, risk versus how formal your procedure or process needs to be?
Yes, indeed. So you see, some changes, for example, sometimes referred to as like for like. You may need to replace an electric cable. And for that, you will not go through an extensive formal change procedure. So there will be little documentation about this. But if we go a step up, let's talk about changing a computer screen. Now, changing the computer screen in the office may be done with little formality similar to the electric cable. But if we were to change this computer screen on, say, a lyophilizer in the manufacturing plant, then we may have to put in a lot more formality because of the higher risk to the environment or the product. So coming back to what I said before, we need to have the risk assessed correctly, and with the level of risk comes the level of formality.
Okay. And would it be your expectation then that if you've prioritized certain items to be higher risk, then you should make a separate section in your SOP to incorporate that? What's your thought on that?
Yes, you definitely will have to have several levels of formality depending on the risk. And the formality could be not necessarily producing hundreds of extra pages of paper, but the formality could be in the process who approves and how changes get approved. It could require extra persons to give you the approval for your change just because of the risk. Think of whether it is a risk that you would have to get approval from the regulators prior to implementing the change. So there you would have to have more formality than, as I mentioned before, just replacing a cable.
Right. So that's a great point. And I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about all the different layers that could be added to higher risk actions, because obviously you want to have a higher level of formality, so there may be more people involved or more steps involved. So maybe you can break it down for us a little bit and talk about the difference in your experience between handling something that's urgent and needs immediate remediation versus something that's planned and necessary to the long-term product quality, but you can manage that sort of in your own timing. And then maybe something that's more temporary, a temporary change.
Yes. You see, so all these types of changes that you mentioned should be described somewhat somehow in the change management SOP.
Sure.
And perhaps let me address these three categories of changes that we have here. So, first of all, you want to plan for changes whenever you can. And so, where you have planned changes, you have a reason to do this, and you go through the formal change procedure to get it approved, implemented, effectiveness verified, and importantly, it becomes a permanent change.
Of course.
But then sometimes you want to have temporary changes just for a defined period of time. And what you want really is you want to return to the previous state that you had. And this could be because there's a need, let's say, for some building work or staff shortages, or there are many, many reasons. Again, what we know is you want to make the change, you plan for it, you can plan for it, and again, if approved, you implement for the desired period, and then you go back to where you were before. Now, just to be clear, some companies use the term planned deviation instead of temporary change. But in fact, it's exactly the same. There's no difference. And so far we talked about things that you can plan for, but only rarely. One may have to implement emergency changes. And I've heard companies tell me, oh, we don't have that. Well, you may have never had them, but they could happen. And so here nobody knows what will be required. There's no planning. It's an emergency. Perhaps there's not even time for approval before the change must be implemented.
Right.
You see, almost always this type of change is triggered by an event that endangers the environment, the health of the people, or the safety. In short, an emergency change is triggered by a deviation. Something goes wrong.
Right.
Perhaps a gas pipe develops a leak, you have to shut down the line, and so on. So what you want to do is, as soon as possible, you again want to do some formality and planning. So you need to decide. So what you had to do as an emergency, do you want to keep this as a temporary change only or as a permanent change? See, the only difference here is you simply can't plan for it because it's an emergency. But you have to go back to the formality of documenting and making sure it's all following your procedure.
So the process is the same, regardless of the type of change we're looking at. The speed with which you address it may be different. Is that fair to say?
Indeed.
Right.
Yes. And the timing of, as you say, the speed. Indeed, yes.
Sometimes you have to move much more quickly. So, we know that change is an inherent part of the life cycle of pharmaceutical products. And unfortunately, so is paperwork. And we've talked about that in the past. Documenting things appropriately and making sure that you're following correct protocol is important. What best practices exist for pre-approvals to changes in like-for-like change scenario? And for our listeners who aren't sure what or haven't heard the term like for like, that's, as I understand it, changing out one part for a part that meets all of the same standards that the original part met, correct?
Well, yes and no. So you see, it's not that terribly easy to answer this, and this is probably why we sometimes also don't find the description in the SOPs in companies. You see, of course, if the items are identical, totally identical, then that is easy.
Right.
Take, for example, the computer cable. I'm absolutely certain you can find an identical cable and replace it. But often they are not exactly the same. And I think, again, it's easier if I give an example. Let's take a pump in manufacturing. You may have a replacement pump somewhere in the warehouse. And this pump may be made of exactly the same material, stainless steel. It may have the same specifications, can pump the same amount, has the same width, etc., etc. But it's made by a different manufacturer. So, to me, this is still like for like. And so what companies probably have to do, rather than to think it has to be identical, is to look at performance and materials that are being used here to come to a useful description of what really constitutes like for like. And as I say, it may be different from company to company what exactly you will allow or won't. I know companies that won't allow a different make, but others do. So again, it's a little bit of a risk-based approach here.
Sure. And like for like, I mean, a lot of times when we're talking about the original specifications for a certain piece of equipment, you have somewhat of a range. I mean, it might be a very small range, but there is a range, right? And so as long as, I mean, I guess technically, as long as something's falling within that range, it could be considered like for like. But that can get a little sticky, right? I mean, talk about that process a little bit more, in that if it's not exact, but it's falls within the range, then do you have to go back and revalidate everything? Do you have to go through more testing? You know what I mean? Though sometimes that can happen. If something just becomes not available anymore, you have to maybe change what you're doing.
You're absolutely right. And just the last thing you said is so very typical. You may have bought a pump only a year ago, and it was model 315. Now all you can get is model 316. And when you look at it, really, there's hardly a difference. Maybe it's got a more beautiful sticker on it or something. But really, this is exactly the point. You need to have technical experts who can look at the materials, who can look at the impact of whatever it is you're changing. So when we when we look at the pump, we will need to look at the engineers and talk to them. And of course, we also need to talk to those who use the pump in the process, because they know best how it affects the product. So typically you will have a team approach in assessing this change. And so what you can put in your procedure, of course, is to say, whenever there is a doubt, please, we need to have a formal risk assessment.
That makes, and of course that makes sense. And you have to get the experts involved, the people who really are the subject matter experts in that particular area of your business. So are there tips though for streamlining, the change process, the requirements of change control process? I mean, we know about pre-approval. Are there times when it's not appropriate or it just can't happen?
Yeah, so you're right. You want to have processes, procedures, SOPs that are relatively easy to use, because once they become too complicated, too convoluted, what will happen is that staff will find ways to circumvent the process. And you really, really want to avoid that.
Right.
And sometimes I also see that the idea of putting in automated system will solve all the problems. And really, the thing is, no. An automated system doesn't think for you. You still have to think for yourself, and you still have to reflect your process within the system. And if your computer system is still too complicated, staff will still find ways to circumvent the process.
And that makes sense. I think as human beings, we're all at times guilty of taking the path of least resistance, right? And so if you have very cumbersome processes in place, or the procedures they're not easy to understand, or for whatever reason, it's difficult to follow along with them, I can see that would give someone an opportunity to take a shortcut, maybe. And I'm wondering about, we hear a lot about data integrity in the industry, and findings from the regulatory agencies when they do audits. And I'm wondering if this is part of what leads to some of those errors, deficiencies or findings related to change control citations, such as inadequate review and approval of the change by quality control unit. Well, if the quality control unit is not easily accessible, or it wasn't clear who in the unit you needed to speak to, maybe that step was skipped. So can you talk about that? I mean, how the two are related?
Yeah, perhaps again with a few examples, it will make it clearer why these things happen. So on one occasion, I saw the procedure for changing the layout of a certificate of analysis, which can be just one piece of paper, that was produced through an automated system, required the input from IT, and it usually took weeks, if not months, until a minor change could be implemented on this. And so this was a laboratory information management system in this company that was used for that. And what was the result? People simply couldn't wait weeks and months before such a change was achieved. Instead, what they did was they created the certificates outside of the system, which resulted in loss of control and traceability. Or in another case, the change that was planned and considered would have required pre-approval from the regulators. And then this company thought, well, getting that approval may take several months. And as the operations team didn't want to wait, they decided to go ahead regardless. But of course, this all came out during the next inspection, and a major finding was the result. So it is really, as we said, if the processes are too complicated, it can really become a problem to follow and to always follow the process within the company.
And that makes complete sense. So in your experience, we talked a little bit about streamlining, but in your experience, what are the best ways to develop these types of SOPs so that they get the job done, they do what you need them to do, but they're not so difficult that people are going to miss a step or completely ignore a step?
Yes. So you simply have to take change control, change management seriously. And as long as all the scenarios are covered by the procedure, such as a like of emergency changes, that is important. But then ultimately, keep the processes manageable. As long as you have an acceptable process flow with the correct safeguarding steps in between to make sure the right people approve that things can be done or not, then you're on a good track.
And obviously that's going to differ from company to company, right?
Absolutely.
Based on your needs. But is there an outline of these things? You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to think for smaller companies maybe who we hear a lot about startups in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, and they're trying to move quickly and create the best products they can. And I'm just thinking if there's a way to streamline some of these SOPs, and that puts them, a little bit ahead. So
ultimately, it's about the risk-based approach. So the level of formality that we talked about earlier,
right.
This is where it comes down to. So you shouldn't not document that you make a change, but how much documentation you put in or how many approvals you will need, that should be different depending on the risk. So if you want to be agile, as you mentioned, as a young startup, for example, absolutely no problem. Please record that a change was made or what the change was, even if you don't necessarily seek approvals for these various changes. The advantage is you can still trace them, you can still go back and find out what was different.
Sure. Okay. So it's all about being able to follow the trail, which is typical. And that's what auditors are going to look for, or inspectors are going to look for when they come through, right? They're going to want to see evidence of every step you've taken to get to the end result. So Indeed. As long as you've accounted for that, change being part of that process, obviously, you'd think that is adequate.
Perfectly adequate. You can always do better, but it's at least you have documented evidence, and that's always a great start.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing that knowledge with us, Siegfried. Some of the areas here can be a little gray for folks, especially I hear a lot of people getting tripped up over the like for like. That happens a lot. We still need to document those changes, even though you may be substituting an identical part. correct. And people sometimes make that mistake. But you've given us so much to think about today, and I really appreciate that. For our listeners, can you highlight the most important takeaways from today's discussion?
It's about understanding your operations. It's understanding who in your company will accept which risk when it comes to change management, and to document this in easy to follow, if ever possible, easy to follow SOP.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Perfect summary. I appreciate it. Thank you for being my guest here again today. It was wonderful to have you back and speaking with our listeners about change control. And to our producer, Ed Sullivan, a big shout out too. He keeps us going from week to week. We appreciate that. And the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. To our listeners, if you've enjoyed today's episode and past episodes, of course, please subscribe in our podcast player of choice and share with your friends and colleagues. We love to share these episodes out on LinkedIn too. So if you are on LinkedIn, we ask you to give it a share there too. You can find out more about the Voices in Validation podcast, as well as IVT Network by visiting ivtnetwork.com. or send an email to customer service at ivtnetwork.com. We'd be happy to answer your questions. And we look forward to you visiting us once again next week when we have another great episode of Voices in Validation. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.